So the last topic in this part of discussion is ecological succession. Now you see, a very important characteristic of all the communities is the fact that the composition and structure constantly changes in response to the changing environmental conditions, and this is something which is also called as adaptation. And this change is very orderly and sequential, and it is parallel with the changes in the physical environment. So these changes lead finally to a community which is near equilibrium with the environment, and that's why it is called as the climax community. So we start with a community which is called as a pioneer community, and finally we move on to a community which is called as climax community. So what is climax and what is pioneer community? We'll just have a discussion on that. You can say that the gradual and fairly predictable change in the species composition of a given area is called as ecological succession. So gradual and fairly predictable change in the species composition of a given area is called as ecological succession. So during succession, some species colonize an area and then their populations become more numerous, whereas populations of other species decline and even disappear. So the entire sequence of communities that successively change in a given area are called as seers. The individual transitional community are termed as seral stages or seral community. So what happens is, in successive seral stages there is a change in the diversity of species, and there is an increase in the number of species and the organisms, as well as the total biomass of that given area. So that's why the present day communities in the world have come to become of succession that has occurred over millions of years since life started on earth. So that's why we can say that succession is a process that starts where no living organisms are there, and these could be areas where it can either start from an area where presently there is no organism but there used to be an organism, or it can start from an area where there has never been an organism. So it can be from areas where no living organisms have ever existed, or it can be in areas which has lost all the living organisms that existed in that area. So if it is starting very new, very fresh, where no organism ever existed, in that case you would call it a primary succession. Or if it is the second case, where the area has lost all the organisms that existed there, in that case you would call it a secondary succession. So this is the difference between a primary succession and secondary succession. So at any time during primary or secondary succession, natural or human induced disturbances can convert a particular seral stage of succession into an earlier stage. So if you have to take an example of primary succession, you can take let's say newly cooled lava as an example, or a bare rock, or a newly created pond or a reservoir. All these kind of things can be seen as a primary succession. Now the establishment of a new biotic community is generally slow. Before a biotic community of a diverse organism can become established, there must be soil. That's the first requirement. Now depending mostly on the climate, it naturally takes several hundred to several thousand years for soil to be fertile or to be established on bare rock. So this is the reason why you will see that primary succession will be very, very slow. Compared to that, secondary succession actually begins in areas where natural biotic communities have been destroyed. For example, you can talk about abundant farmlands, or burned or cut forest, lands that have been flooded. So all these are secondary successions. So since some soil or sediment is already present there, the secondary succession is always faster. This is always faster as compared with primary succession. Now if you observe, generally when we talk about the description of ecological succession, we normally talk about the changes in vegetation. Now if you look at this particular point, at any time during primary or secondary succession, natural or human induced disturbances can convert a particular seral stage of succession to an earlier stage. And apart from that, these kind of disturbances can also create new kinds of conditions that can support one particular organism or species and disturb or sometimes discourage and eliminate the other species. So this all happens with ecological succession. Now, next thing that we need to discuss is succession of plants, because most of the times when you are talking about ecological succession, we are talking about vegetation, as we just discussed. So that's why we need to discuss succession of plants. So based on the nature of the habitat, the succession of plants is called hydrarch or xerarch. So what is hydrarch or what is xerarch? So the hydrarch succession takes place in wetter areas, and the successional series progress from hydric to mesic conditions. What is mesic? Something which is neither too wet nor too dry. So such kind of condition would be called as a mesic condition. So opposite to this is a xerarch condition, where the succession takes place in dry areas and the series progress from xeric to mesic conditions. The species that invade a bare area are called as pioneer species. We just discussed this, that the first species would be called as a pioneer species and the last would be called as a climax species. Then in primary succession on rocks, these are usually lichens which are able to secrete acids to dissolve rock, helping in weathering and soil formation. So key point here is the fact that in primary succession on rocks, usually lichens are the ones which are pioneer species. Also, these later pave way for some very small plants like bryophytes, which are able to take hold of small amount of soil. So what are bryophytes? Bryophytes basically are small plants, like you can talk about moss or liverworts or hornworts. So these are the buffer species between the pioneer species and the other species that are going to come after bryophytes. So they are with time succeeded by bigger plants, and after several more stages, ultimately a stable climax forest community is formed. So the climax community remains stable as long as the environment remains unchanged. With time, the xerophytic habitat gets converted into a mesophytic one. So this will happen for xerophytic as well, and this is happen for a hydrarch community as well. Now next is primary succession in water. So in water, the pioneers are small phytoplanktons. They are replaced with time by free floating angiosperms, then by rooted hydrophytes, sedges, grasses, and finally the trees. So the climax again would be a forest. With time, water body is converted into land. So this is very, very important point. Now if we talk about secondary succession, then the species that invade depend on the conditions of the soil, availability of water, the environment, as also the seeds or other propagules that are present. So since soil is already there, the rate of succession is much faster, and hence the climate is also reached much more quickly. So which of the following is faster, primary succession or secondary succession? The answer would be secondary succession. Why? Because there is already a presence of soil, or if soil is present, obviously nutrients are present, and that's why this is easily done, or it's easier to carry out than a primary succession. So first of all, phytoplanktons will exist. From there you will come here to submerged plant stages. Then from there you would have the free floating plants for the first time. From there you move on to reed swamp stage. Then from there marsh meadow stage will be formed. Scrub stage will come here, and then finally you have a forest. So ultimately the water body got converted into land or a forest. Now what is also very important to understand is that in succession, particularly when we talk about primary succession, it is a very slow process. It may take thousands of years for the climax to be reached. Another important factor is that all successions, whether taking place in water or taking place in land, they proceed to a very similar stage, that is a mesic stage, which is neither too low nor too high in its water content. So this is all about ecological succession.